Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ian Biggs holds a Bachelor of Arts degree with double honours from the University of Sydney and a Master of Arts degree in International Relations from the Australian National University. He served overseas as ambassador to Saudi Arabia from 2005 until 2008, which is where he actually met His Excellency Ambassador Yasser Yakash. He was also serving as ambassador to Saudi Arabia at the same time. So this friendship and partnership goes back to 2005. He has earlier had overseas postings in Austria, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. He has previously served on the secondment as Special Assistant to the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency. Ambassador Biggs is a senior career officer with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and he's most recently served as head of the Secretariat for International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, a position he held until August 2008. The lecture topic that he's chosen, Multilateral Diplomacy, the Case of Nuclear Non-Proliferation. Please join me in a very, very warm welcome for His Excellency Ambassador Ian Biggs. Thank you.
Talk from here, since that makes it easier for me to manage. Now, there's a saying in English they talk about going from the sublime to the ridiculous, and I feel that's what I'm doing, because I have to say I'm completely floored by the notion of analyzing foreign policy choices in a mathematical model. It's a noble concept, and one that I shan't even attempt at this stage. I'm sorry. What I want to talk about, however, is an example of practical multilateral diplomacy. Perhaps if I move this a bit further away, it won't make so much noise. International efforts to deal with nuclear proliferation, under the rubric of nuclear non-proliferation, have a long history. I want to try and persuade people that it's a relatively successful history, and that this is an example of diplomacy functioning well. I prepared notes. They are far too long, and so I shall cut vigorously, because I think I've been asked to limit my talk to 15-20 minutes, and so if I go over, you'll all be asleep and the world won't be a safer place. I don't have a lot to prove here, because in Turkey, we're among friends. Turkey and Australia are both strongly committed to a rules-based international system embodied in the United Nations, and more specifically preventing the spread of nuclear weapons. And the evidence for that is that next week foreign ministers will be participating together in a ministerial meeting of the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Initiative in Istanbul. There has been a shift in the wind, not just the atmosphere outside with a sandstorm. I don't know where that came from, sand outside Ankara, but a shift in the wind of disarmament thinking and non-proliferation thinking over the last decade. If you reflect back to the unilateralism and what might be called lawlessness of 10 years ago, the era of the invasion of Iraq, that has been succeeded by a period in which the debates about the challenges we face in Libya, Syria, Iran, and elsewhere are actually being held primarily in the Security Council, as we would suggest they should be. And even more revealing, there have been several positive, truly positive items in the nuclear news in the last year or so, whether or not there's a great deal of awareness about them. For example, there has been agreement on and considerable planning towards a conference this year on a Middle East zone free of weapons of mass destruction to involve all of the countries of the region, including Iran and Israel. There's been agreement, or there was agreement between the United States and North Korea about desisting from weapons-related activities in exchange for humanitarian assistance. And there was, very recently, a resumption of negotiations between Iran and the permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany about the nature of Iran's nuclear activities. There's also been agreement between the United States and the Russian Federation on radical reductions in nuclear warhead numbers and missile numbers. Now, for every announcement, of course, there have been, and very likely will be more, disappointments and reversals to come. But the overall direction towards the stigmatization of nuclear weapons and the entrenchment of a global expectation of restraint is nevertheless evident. My concern is that there's an intellectual sloppiness in the partisan politics of many countries, I'm not going to name any of them, of course, and the transient headlines of the news media, a direction of skepticism about multilateralism, an easy applause line which says that nothing works when it goes through the United Nations, that the talk shop is almost by definition a failure. And that's essentially what I want to argue against. I'm not going to point any fingers because I'm a diplomat. I'm here to represent Australia, and that would not be appropriate. It's also not necessary in this vicinity because Australia and Turkey, and I expect most of the countries represented here, are in the same direction. The body of international law governing most aspects of modern life is, I want to assert, remarkably robust. It's that body which is at the level of high strategy and also at the level of practical implementation represented in the United Nations system, though it goes a long way beyond that, and I'll mention some of the ways that it goes beyond that in the nuclear context. Even at the level of high strategy, where aggression and border disputes and hostile commercial actions most obviously violate the United Nations Charter, you will observe that no one ever admits to being an outlaw. In other words, the expectation is there. And making excuses and finding rationalizations for what one does is a perverse complement to the regime itself. The collective efforts of the Security Council have been remarkably effective, and this is where I would refer people to some of my favorite databases. I'm sure you use them all the time, but some are maintained by Project Plowshares in the nuclear field. The International Institute of Strategic Studies has a good one, and the Uppsala Conflict Data Program also together demonstrate a secular decline, an overall decline in armed conflict, which is, after all, the primary responsibility of the Security Council. The counts vary depending on definitions, but one of my favorites is the Human Security Report, showing a 70% decline in the number of high-intensity conflicts since the end of the Cold War. Lots of definitional issues, but still a practical success for the Security Council in its primary mandate. Fighting constitutes news, and therefore the public awareness that we are passing through a long peace, through an age of peace, is not widespread. And of course, the involvement of the United States and indeed Australia in conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan and so on have skewed those perceptions even further. But the next time that you hear someone saying with perhaps a sneer that the international machinery of cooperative security is ineffectual, I would suggest that there are some metrics to rate the effectuality of the Security Council and the whole system. And that's a general assertion about multilateralism. I want to talk specifically about nuclear weapons because nuclear weapons are still the most likely answer to the question, how does the story end? There are 23,000 of these things still deployed or in various states of readiness. And the fact that for 67 years they haven't been used may encourage complacency, but doesn't mean that they won't be. The assumption has to be that at some point, through misadventure or miscalculation, or perhaps madness on the part of particular national leaders, they will be used, and that could very well be the end of many things. The particular instances that are most often cited to argue against the thesis that nuclear non-proliferation is successful are the outlier states, so North Korea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and then of course Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, are really the only two instances at the moment where proliferation is an immediate prospect and a significant concern to the system. There is the corollary that is frequently cited that if either of these cases succeeds and achieves their foreign policy objectives through the acquisition of a nuclear weapons capability, then we would face a cascade. But I would suggest that being here in Ankara is precisely the right place to be to see through that. And I have no expectation from talking to Turkish officials that a breakout on the part of Iran or anything else would cause Turkey, for example, to break all its undertakings and all of its own calculations of national interest and head in a similar direction. The experience of both North Korea and Iran has been, for any foreign policy maker, profoundly unattractive. No one likes to be a pariah, and no one likes to be sanctioned. This is probably the point at which to refer to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, because that is the fundamental document underlying the system of international nuclear restraint. It was set up in the late 1960s after a succession of previous related treaties, because it seemed at that point that many countries were going nuclear. There was a sense that the madness needed to stop before it spread too far. And so it has a temporal boundary. The formal criteria for setting out who was entitled to have and to keep nuclear weapons had the recognition of states which had manufactured or exploded a nuclear weapon or other nuclear explosive device before the 1st of January 1967. Curious, and of course the basis for great resentment ever since. But it's also an obvious bargain, because to say that no more nuclear weapon states would be permitted after the conclusion of the Non-Proliferation Treaty is the best that anyone has been able to suggest for limiting that madness. That was the great concern of the late 1960s. The treaty itself has attained almost universal adherence. There are only three non-members, three states not party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and you know them: India, Pakistan, and Israel. And a very strong norm, which has held for those 67 years, against nuclear acquisition and use. And if the entrenchment of treaty law has a great deal to do with demonstrated norms, then the NPT has to be one of the strongest. The NPT is based on a number of interlocking bargains. I shan't go through them here, because if you want to read the transcripts of the NPT review conferences, you can have the full pleasure of hearing all about why, for some people, the peaceful uses of nuclear energy takes precedence. For others, it's all about preventing proliferation. And for many countries, and certainly many of the people who speak on the subject, disarmament is the preeminent goal of the NPT system. Australia, I should say, just as an aside, tends to the notion that the fundamental purpose of the Non-Proliferation Treaty is to prevent proliferation, and that the other goods that can come from that don't override the need to prevent a further outbreak. There's a particularly fine net assessment of the effectiveness of the NPT done by a man called Lou Dunn, D-U-N-N, that I recommend people to read when they want to attempt a quantitative, if not quite mathematical, assessment of the effectiveness of the various provisions of the treaty. He concludes that the world is lucky to have an instrument of almost universal application. It's an elegant balancing of disarmament, non-proliferation, and peaceful uses, of security and development, of realism and equity, and of flexibility and consistency. And that's why the number of nuclear armed states has actually been capped, even for those outside the regime, at a level well below that of previous decades. It's been the treaty that is a useful lever to extract disarmament from the recognized nuclear weapon states, who would otherwise have had no particular reason to forego the expansion of their own weapons arsenals. And the global norm is now so strong that no aspirant state, with the exception of North Korea, has ever admitted to having a weapons program. Instead, programs are always peaceful, right up until the point that suddenly it's declared that India and Pakistan, for example, have flouted the taboo. Pariah status is the price that has been paid by every state in flouting that taboo over the last 40 years. Countries like my own that have absolutely no interest in bringing nuclear weapons to our part of the world are able to feel virtuous for serving our own strategic interests through self-denial. When the commission that I was secretary to, the International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, had meetings with the officials of the non-NPT states of India, Pakistan and Israel, we were intrigued to find that their officials in every case hoped for good outcomes from the review conferences and other meetings of the NPT because they thought it was a fine treaty, just not for them. One of the interesting efforts of the NPT system has been, as I've indicated, to get the existing and legitimized nuclear weapon states, the 5 who happen to be permanent members of the Security Council, to make various offerings on the disarmament front and assurances on the proliferation front. And one of the interesting exercises always is to attempt to parse what is said there. The example that I dragged out this time is the United States assurance, where it says the United States reaffirms that it will not use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear weapon states parties to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, except in the case of an invasion or any other attack on the United States, its territories, its armed forces or other troops, its allies, or on a state towards which it has a security commitment carried out or sustained by such a non-nuclear weapon state in association or alliance with a nuclear weapon state. I'm sure you feel safe now. It's an interesting exercise, but the fact that it has to be undertaken is the assurance that we are heading in the right direction. I was going to talk about the IAEA, but I suspect I should give that a miss because we're already 15 minutes into the 20 that I said I would restrict myself to. There's also a whole range of what we might call plurilateral organizations that can be referred to as part of the machinery of the NPT. In trade diplomacy, they make this distinction between multilateral or open-ended global organizations and plurilateral ones, which are more or less like-minded. It's not used in quite the same way in security politics, but I could use it to describe groups like the Nuclear Suppliers Group or the Tsanga Committee. There is another one more recently, the Proliferation Security Initiative. I won't attempt to describe all of them, but they are good faith efforts to collaborate, to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. And the primary justification for what have been called discriminatory regimes has to be that they are in fact the opposite of cartels, that they are voluntarily limiting, the members are voluntarily limiting their own trade in the cause of a safer world. The NSG, for example, puts very severe impediments in the way of its members' trade in the nuclear field, and if that's discriminatory, I think it's a good thing. Now, the primary weakness of the NPT system has routinely been identified as its discriminatory nature, as because of that line that I talked about in 1967 that says when a government is or is not entitled to have nuclear weapons. This is the false dichotomy that the NPT is normally criticized for embodying, treating disarmament as somehow the appropriate concern of the non-aligned movement and non-proliferation as that of the nuclear weapon states. But no weapon state is ever going to disarm while other states are in the business of acquiring nuclear weapons, and no promise on the part of a non-nuclear weapon state to renounce nuclear weapons forever is going to be reliable if the states that already have them show that they continue to find them attractive and useful. And that's the challenge that is faced by all the diplomats of countries associated with the nuclear weapon states in arrangements such as NATO or Australia's own equivalent, the ANZUS Treaty. I think I should wind up by talking a little bit about Australia's own position on this, because that's what I'm paid to do. The basic reason that Australia has, for successive governments, in other words, without party politics coming into it, been in favour of non-proliferation and indeed of disarmament, is that a world with thousands of nuclear weapons is simply unsustainably and unacceptably dangerous. We have the instinct of a good international citizen to contribute actively to peace and security, and also to major international projects such as disarmament. There's also, for us, a moral obligation with reputational risk attached if it isn't honoured that comes with being a major exporter of uranium. And although we export for civil nuclear energy, there can be no doubt that if this ever went wrong, the two things are very difficult to separate in a permanent way. Public opinion and public policy demand that we should be able to vouch that all Australian origin uranium doesn't end up in nuclear weapons, which gives us this incentive to be part of the NPT system. And then, of course, we have our extended relationship with the United States, just as Turkey does, and Japan and Korea, and all the NATO countries. We've forsworn nuclear weapons ourselves in order to giving us a vital strategic interest in ensuring that there are no nuclear weapons in our own strategic environment. We've been able to achieve that through the negotiation of a number of nuclear weapon-free zones. And I shan't go through all of that. The reason that we do this is that Australia's stake is unusually great. At the other end of the world's sea lanes, we have to be confident that the oceans are a domain of laws, and as an export-dependent economy, we are threatened by any failures of the international legal system. And on and on. I think you get the general idea. I do want to just wind up by saying that the big change of the last 3 years has been the change in the weather, as I said at the beginning, the change in the international mood. We can probably trace it very precisely to the point in 2007 when a number of US statesmen who'd previously held very different views, people such as Kissinger and Schultz, adopted nuclear disarmament and rigorous non-proliferation as not merely their objective, but as they saw it, an imperative for the world. That's my theory. Refutation's welcome.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. And I think in many ways I also see the field of cultural diplomacy developing in similar ways in terms of really going from the unilateral to the multilateral. And I think really the future that we see for cultural diplomacy is very much in the multilateral context. So thank you very much for your contributions. I would like to take a few questions and comments. We are running a little bit behind schedule, so I would ask everyone limit it to one question each. And if we could be as concise as possible, that will allow as many voices as possible. Please.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation. My name is Arife Köse. I am from the ICANN, International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And hopefully we will be in Vienna at the end of April for the PrEP-Comp of Non-Proliferation Treaty. And well, actually I have two questions. I'm sorry, but just yes, I will be brief. One is about NPT, of course, because I think nuclear proliferation has been addressed in terms of arms control, arms limitation, and decrease the number of nuclear weapons. But what about the evolution without making any discrimination between countries like nuclear states or non-nuclear states? What do you think about this? Because, I mean, for instance, Turkey, yes, the government is against nuclear weapons, But not officially it is declared, but we have NATO's nuclear weapons in the Incirlik military base, and there are NATO's nuclear weapons in European states. So, and in NATO's new strategy, they didn't deny the nuclear weapons, nuclear deterrence. So this is one problem. And another question is about the nuclear free zone in the Middle East conference. It's due to happen in December at the end of this year, hopefully. And how do you think we can include Israel in this conference? Because it seems the main problem at the moment, actually. Not officially, but again, some of the Israel officials said they will not attend this conference until the peace is remained in the region, in the Middle East. So how can we make this conference a success in terms of keeping peace in the Middle East?
Okay.
Thank you.
And Your Excellency, if you'd agree, can we take a third question
Please.
before the final responses, please?
Thank you very much. My name is Noah Poya. I come from Uganda, a student, Master of Arts student in peacekeeping and in peacebuilding and conflict management. My question is, Your Excellency, is directed to North Korea. Recently, there has been the failed testing of nuclear innovations in North Korea. And North Korea has been a kind of block in global peace. I wonder what you think is likely to happen because of the failure of their testing of the nuclear innovations. There are two thoughts. One is that there could be some kind of failing might make it more proactive in a way that maybe they would think of making other innovations that would still threaten peace. But also the other one is that maybe it makes them now reduce a little bit of the innovations because of the failed tests. What is your take? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. If you'd be good enough to please offer some responses and concluding remarks, that would be excellent. Thank you.
Look, firstly, thank you, Oliver. I work closely with ICANN in Australia, fine contributor to the civil society effort for non-proliferation and disarmament, and good luck with your participation in the next PrepCom. It's true, arms control has been the major achievement of the NPT, in other words, limiting growth rather than getting to zero. There is, however, a commitment that has been restated a number of times by all the NPT nuclear weapon states to disarmament, and one must believe that that is their long-term objective, and one that the international community holds them to periodically through the NPT review process. And I'm not going to doubt that, because that's obviously what all the members of the NPT are hoping for, expecting, and working towards. I can't speak, of course. It wouldn't be appropriate for me to speak on Turkish policy in relation to deployment of NATO armament and so forth. I'll merely say that that Turkey is, with Australia, an active participant in the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Initiative, which is attempting, I think quite effectively, to impose transparency on the disarmament undertakings of the nuclear weapon states. It's one of the more innovative attempts to put some kind of transparency into the debate. The Middle East weapons of mass destruction, the Middle East Zone Free of Weapons of Mass Destruction conference that is to be held this year, we trust, is supposed to include Israel, and that is certainly the basis on which planning is underway. I hope that will be the case. There is clearly a policy divide within Israel about the ways to deploy its strategic advantages. Just as with Turkey, it would not be appropriate for me to speak about that debate in detail, other than to say that the planning of the conference assumes that Israel will take part, and there were indications at the time this was adopted in the 2010 NPT Review Conference that Israel would indeed be there. We hope so, and that's otherwise it's not going to get very far. No, the North Korean case is, as I suggested, probably the only direct challenge to the legitimacy of international law in the nuclear field. Every other case attempts to frame its actions in terms of legitimacy and acting in accordance with international law. North Korea very specifically has chosen to do otherwise, and that's why they are under such tight sanctions and why there are so many international efforts over many years to hold them to the standards that the rest of the international community has adopted. You have correctly identified the two likely responses to the failure of the rocket test a few days ago. Either they will try harder, or maybe they will pull back. I don't know which is likely, but I do know that the international effort will be to make sure that the technology doesn't get through, that the rewards that might come with compliance with Security Council demands won't come through, so long as there continue to be challenges to that, to those international demands, and there will be a continuing level of surveillance and monitoring of all of the activities relevant to nuclear technology in North Korea, such that no other country is likely to see this as a model to be followed. And in that sense, the international effort has already succeeded in keeping the North Korean case as an outlier, as a very unhappy exception to the global regime. Should I wind up at this point?
Sure.
Merely by way of saying, I did want to thank Mark and Ambassador Yakish for the opportunity to speak here. This has been an unusual chance in Turkey to talk to a truly expert group of international relations theorists, and I'm sorry if I can't quantify my assertions in the way that would justify a true IR tag. There we are.
No, thank you very much, Your Excellency, and I'd ask everyone to please join in expressing our sincere gratitude to His Excellency Ambassador Ian Briggs.